In the winter of 1872, a man named George Newton Longcore left Independence, Kansas, with his infant daughter Mary Ann and traveled down the Great Osage Trail to resettle in Iowa. They would never arrive in Iowa, and they were never seen again. Then a few months later, in the spring of 1873, Longcore's former neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, went looking for them and started questioning everyone along the trail. He too would disappear and would never be seen alive again. Reports of missing people who had passed through this area had become so common that travelers began to avoid the trail. People didn't know it at the time, but there was a family of serial killers living out in Labette County, Kansas, that killed at least 11 people. This is the very strange story of the Bloody Benders. In October 1870, 5 families of spiritualists settled in the township of Osage in northwestern Labette County. One of these families was the Benders. At this time, only John Sr. and his supposed son, John Jr., were in Labette County, coming out to register land. They registered about 160 acres of land next to the Great Osage Trail, which at the time was the only open road for traveling further west. After a cabin, a barn with a corral, and a well were built in 1871, John Sr.'s supposed wife and daughter, Elvira and Kate Bender, arrived in the fall of 1871. The Benders then divided their cabin into 2 separate rooms using a canvas. They used the smaller room at the back of the cabin as their home, and they used the front room of the cabin as a general store, where they sold mostly dried goods like vegetables to travelers. The front section also contained a kitchen and a dining table, where these travelers could stop for a meal or even spend the night. Elvira and Kate also planted a 2-acre vegetable garden and apple orchard just around the cabin. Sounds pretty nice, until you realize what was actually in the soil helping all of this shit grow. Now, since all we have are these sketches of the family, I'll try to give them some personality so that you can imagine what kind of pieces of shit we're dealing with today. John Bender Sr. was believed to be around 60 years old and spoke very little English, and the English he did speak was usually unintelligible. His supposed wife Elvira Bender was said to be about 55 years old. Allegedly, Elvira couldn't speak or even understand English, and she was so unfriendly that her neighbors called her a she-devil. I imagine in the 1870s that was about the same as calling somebody a cunt. They weren't wrong. This family killed a shit ton of people. Now, John Bender Jr. was around 25, spoke English fluently but with a German accent, and was often seen laughing aimlessly, which led people to consider him a half-wit. But to be fair with him, I do the same thing with my voiceovers. But calling him a half-wit, I imagine, is the same thing as calling him a cunt. And finally, the daughter Kate Bender was around 23, she was educated, attractive, and she spoke English very well with no accent. And she was also a self-proclaimed healer and psychic. So basically, a cunt. And she would hand out flyers advertising her supernatural powers and ability to cure illnesses. She conducted seances and even gave lectures on spiritualism, and eventually Kate's popularity became a big attraction for the Benders Inn. So how they lured most of their victims in. And even though the elder Benders mostly kept to themselves, the supposed son and daughter often attended Sunday school. Now, I keep saying supposed because people don't know if this bunch of cunts were even related. They could have been, or they could have just enjoyed being around other cunts like themselves. Nobody really knows, but it is widely speculated that the Benders were German immigrants. However, no documentation or definitive proof of their relationships to one another or where they were born has ever been found. John Bender Sr. was either from Germany, Norway, or the Netherlands, and all that anyone really knows about him for sure is that his surname was certainly not Bender. Now, according to newspapers from the time, Elvira was born as Elmira Hill in the Adirondack Mountains, which is in New York State, and it's believed that at some point she was married to a guy named Simon Mark, with who she claimed to have had 12 children. Simon probably died soon after, because Elvira was rumored to have murdered several husbands. Kate was supposedly Elvira's 5th daughter, but some of the Benders' neighbors claimed that John Jr. and Kate were not brother and sister, but husband and wife. So, nobody really knows. So let's all just agree that we got a bunch of losers here, and it doesn't really change what they did. And let me tell you, they did a lot of shit. In May 1871, the body of a man named Jones was discovered in Drum Creek. His throat was slashed and his skull was crushed. The owner of Drum Creek then came under suspicion. However, no action was taken against him. Then in February 1872, 2 more bodies were found that had the same injuries as Jones. Their throats slashed and their skulls were crushed. And once again, no one had any idea who did it. By 1873, reports of missing people who had passed through the Great Osage Trail had become so common that travelers began to avoid the trail. One of those travelers, of course, was George Newton Longcore and his daughter Mary Ann. Now, since they were never found, their disappearance or death was never credited to the Benders. Then, of course, Longcore's former neighbor, Dr. Henry York, went looking for him and found himself missing as well. Well, to quote the legendary Rick Grimes, the Benders,
"They're fucking with the wrong people."
Because Henry York had 2 brothers. His one brother, named Colonel Alexander York, was a Civil War veteran, a lawyer, and a state senator. And his other brother was Ed. Just Ed York. I don't really know what he did.
Any powers you want to tell us about? Any,
No, I don't have one. I just saw the ad.
No superpowers at all?
I have both type 1 and 2 diabetes.
Ow!
Thanks for coming, Ed. You're in the story now. Now, both brothers knew of Henry's travel plans, and when he failed to return, they began their own search for him. Colonel York, leading a company of about 50 men, questioned every traveler along the trail, and he visited every home in the area. On March 28, 1873, Colonel York arrived at the Benders Inn. Kate and John Jr., being the only 2 that could speak English, answered the door and told Colonel York that Dr. York did indeed stay with them, and they suggested that he probably ran into trouble with Indians after he had left the inn. Horrifyingly, Colonel York then stayed for dinner. You'll understand why that's horrifying later on in the story. Anyway, Colonel York then survives dinner, most likely because he had 50 people outside the cabin, and over the next couple of days he questions more of the locals, and Colonel York comes to learn that recently a woman was seen screaming and running out of the Benders Inn. Apparently Elvira was threatening this woman with a knife. So on April 3rd, Colonel York returns to the Benders Inn with his 50 armed men to have a chat with Elvira. Elvira, of course, doesn't understand English, so she's just kinda staring at him. But when York repeats the claims, Elvira got so pissed off that she pimped herself out like the dumb bitch she was and told York in English that the woman was a witch who had cursed her coffee. Which, to be fair, I don't blame Elvira. I will also stab someone for fucking with my coffee. But Colonel York was a man of principle, and he realized now that Elvira can actually understand English, and began to question how trustworthy the Benders really were. I imagine that he was probably thinking this.
"You've now just confirmed in my mind you're not trustworthy, so fuck you."
Anyway, Elvira then told York and his men to leave, but before he left, Kate told Colonel York to return alone the following Friday night, and she would use her psychic abilities to find his brother. At this point though, the 50 armed men with York were convinced that the Benders, as well as their neighbors, a family called the Roaches, were guilty, and they wanted to hang them all. But Colonel York, being a man of principle, insisted that they must first find the evidence. A massive mistake in hindsight, because the Benders in fact were guilty, but I suppose Colonel York did do the right thing. Pretty soon after this, the neighboring communities began to make accusations that the Osage community were responsible for all of the disappearances, and the Osage Township arranged a meeting. 75 locals attended the meeting, including Colonel York and maybe possibly the Benders as well. After discussing all of the disappearances, including that of Dr. Henry York, they agreed to obtain a warrant to search every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. Now, despite Colonel York and his men's strong suspicions regarding the Benders since his visit, no one kept an eye on what they were doing. 3 days after the township meeting, a man driving cattle past the Bender property noticed that the cabin was now abandoned and the farm animals were unfed. The man quickly reported this to the township trustee, but as is tradition in unsolved mysteries, due to bad weather, several days had passed before the abandonment could be investigated. After the rain had passed though, several hundred volunteers turned up to search the cabin. However, the cabin was completely empty. There was no food, no clothes, no items or personal belongings, and it was clear that the Benders had taken this opportunity to get away. Now, while searching the cabin, the search party noticed a bad smell, and they traced it to a trapdoor underneath a bed that was nailed shut. After opening the trapdoor, they found a small empty room underneath the cabin. This room was about 2 meters deep, 2 meters wide, and 1 meters long. And old nasty clotted blood covered the stone slab floor. The men then broke up the stone floor with sledgehammers, but underneath they again found nothing. They determined though that the smell was from blood that had soaked into the soil. The volunteers then physically lifted the entire cabin and moved it to the side so that they could dig under it, but again they found nothing. Then after a couple of hours of probing the ground with sticks around the cabin, they finally found something. They found Dr. Henry York's body, buried face down with his feet barely below the surface. Soon after, they found another 8 bodies in shallow graves, one more in a well nearby, and several dismembered body parts buried all around the cabin. All but one of the bodies had their skulls crushed with a hammer and their throats slashed. This body belonged to a young girl who had no injury severe enough to cause death, so it was speculated that she had been strangled or buried alive. Now what happened after this was fucking crazy. A Kansas newspaper reported that the crowd was so outraged after finding the bodies that a friend of the Benders named Brockman was hung from a beam in the inn until he went unconscious. They took him down and revived him, interrogated him, and hung him again. They only released him after the 3rd hanging. A Roman Catholic prayer book was then found in the house with notes inside written in German. Some of these notes said, quote, Johanna Bender, or Johanna Bender, born July 30, 1848. John Chabard, came to America July 1st, 18 ? Big slaughter day, Jan 8th. And the last note they could translate said hell departed. Probably felt very cool writing that. Now after this, detectives set out looking for the Benders, and they followed their wagon tracks from their cabin to their actual wagon, which was also abandoned and had a starving team of horses. Wouldn't expect anything less from this bunch of cunts. Now the wagon was found just outside the city limits of Thayer, about 12 miles or 19 kilometers away from the Benders Inn. Now I gotta let you know that the Benders were never officially seen again after that township meeting. And the last thing that is known for sure about them is that it was confirmed that the Bender family had bought tickets on the Leavenworth, Lawrence and Galveston Railroad to make their way to Humboldt, Kansas. It seems, or it is believed, that in Chanute, Kansas, John Jr. and Kate switched over to another train which supposedly took them somewhere in Texas. From there, it is assumed that they traveled to an outlaw colony. Detectives and lawmen, though, didn't bother chasing them, because lawmen following outlaws into this region often never returned. Fair enough. Well, suffice it to say, they pretty much got away with it. News of the murder spread quickly, and more than 3,000 people, including reporters from as far away as New York City and Chicago, visited the site of the Benders Inn. The Benders' cabin was completely destroyed by souvenir hunters. They took everything, including the bricks that lined the cellar and the stones that lined the well. And you know, I get judged by some people for collecting Funko Pops, but I always tell them, hey, it could be worse, I could be collecting serial killer bricks. Colonel Alexander York then offered a $1,000 reward for the family's arrest. Quite a decent chunk of change back then. But then the Kansas governor made it an even chunkier chunk of change and offered an additional $2,000 for the apprehension of the Benders. Now while the people searched for their $3,000 bounty, it gave lawmen and detectives some time to figure out just what exactly the Benders were doing. Now it is assumed that when a guest stayed at the Benders Bed and Breakfast Inn, the Benders would give the guest a seat of honor at the table that was positioned over that trapdoor that led into the cellar. While seated at this table, their back would be to that curtain canvas that separated the cabin in half, and it is thought that Kate would distract the guest while John Bender Sr. or Jr. came from behind the curtain and struck the guest on the right side of the head with a hammer. This might explain why most of the victims' skulls were crushed on the right-hand side. It is thought that one of the ladies then would cut the victim's throat to ensure death, and then the body would be dropped through the trap door. Once in the cellar, the body would be stripped and the valuables would be taken, and the body would be buried somewhere on the property, most often in the orchard where most of the bodies were found. Although some of the victims were wealthy, others carried little of value, and it's believed that the Benders killed them simply for the sheer thrill, because the Benders were just a bunch of cunts. But it's kinda horrifying to think that if Colonel York didn't have his 50 armed men outside the cabin, would the Benders have smashed him as well? Probably. They did smash his brother, so if that had happened, how long would these fuckers have done this for? They probably would have increased their KD by quite a lot, but I'm sure at some point somebody eventually would have caught them, because a lot of potential victims of the Benders actually escaped from them. My only question is, why didn't any of these potential victims say or do anything sooner? Maybe they were traumatized, maybe they did try to spread the word. Nobody really knows, but here's a handful of survivor reports. A guy named William Pickering said that he refused to sit near the canvas that divided the room because of the stains on it. Kate Bender then threatened him with a knife, and he managed to escape alive. Another survivor, who was actually a Catholic priest, named Father Paul Ponziglion, claimed to have seen one of the Bender men concealing a large hammer, at which point he became uncomfortable and quickly escaped from the inn. Then a lady named Mrs. Fitz was sitting at the table and heard a muffled sound from behind the canvas. It made her feel uneasy, and she also decided to quickly run out of the cabin. Finally, two men who had traveled to the inn to experience Kate Bender's psychic powers stayed for dinner but refused to sit at the table next to the cloth, instead preferring to eat their meal at the main shop counter. Kate then apparently became abusive towards them, and shortly afterwards John Cena and John Senior and John Jr. came out from behind the cloth. At this point, the two men felt uneasy and they decided to leave. Can you just imagine that you're sitting with this family in their inn and you're having dinner and you're like, wow, this is such a lovely dinner, you're such a lovely family, and then John Cena's like,
Are you sure about that?
yeah, no, we shouldn't make jokes about this. During the investigation of the cabin, more than a dozen bullet holes were found in the roof and the walls. It is believed that this is from victims attempting to fight back after being hit with the hammer. All in all, the Benders are confirmed to have killed at least 11 people, but some believe that they easily killed more than 20. Several weeks after the discovery of the bodies, several of the Benders' neighbors were arrested as accessories. About 12 men of, quote, bad repute in general were arrested, including Brockman, the man the townspeople hung repeatedly, as well as Addison Roach and his son-in-law, William Buxton. It became known that all of these men had been involved in disposing of the victim's stolen goods with a guy named Mitt Cherry, a member of the Vigilance Committee, and he was also found guilty for forging a letter from one of the victims, informing the man's wife that he had arrived safely at his destination in Illinois. It's not relevant, but if there was any part of you saying Brockman didn't deserve to be hung 3 times, he would be arrested again 23 years later for the rape and murder of his own 18-year-old daughter. So fuck him. As for the Benders, nobody really knows what happened to them, but people would be misidentified as them all the time. And there's like a whole story of how some woman got misidentified as Elvira Bender. She then went to court, people testified that that woman was in fact Elvira Bender, but the judge ultimately decided that it can't be her. This woman spoke fluent English, and Elvira could speak English, but she struggled. So the mystery then is what happened to the Benders after that township meeting. That is the real mystery of this story. So with that said, it's time to get into some theories. Now, quick disclaimer, these are not really theories. They're more like reports that are most likely bullshit. So starting off with bullshit report number 1. One detective later claimed that he had traced John Jr. and Kate to the border, where people believe that they went to join an outlaw colony. According to this detective, he found that John Jr. died of apoplexy, which is a rupture of an internal organ. The same detective also claimed that the elder Benders did not leave the train at Humboldt, but instead they continued north to Kansas City, where they purchased some tickets to head to St. Louis, Missouri. And that's it. So what does that mean to us? Nothing. There's no more information on it. He wasted our time. Bullshit report number 2. I mentioned that people were absolutely certain that Bender wasn't the real surname of John Sr. Some people assumed that it may have been Flickinger.
Are you sure about that?
Well, in 1884, it was reported that a guy named John Flickinger forfeit the game in Lake Michigan. Yeah, I know, I would prefer to speak unfiltered, but I do need to start using euphemisms because YouTube loves to delete my videos. Anyway, nothing more came of this report with John Flickinger. I'm sure it's possible though that more than one man in 1884 could be named John Flickinger. Also in 1884, an elderly man matching John Bender Sr.'s description was arrested in Montana for a murder committed near Salmon, Idaho, where the victim had been killed by a hammer blow to the head. While he was being held in jail, a message requesting positive identification that this man is John Bender was sent to the prison, but this man then severed his own foot to escape from the prison. Shortly thereafter, he bled to death. By the time that a deputy arrived that could make this identification, it was already impossible due to this man's decomposition. However, despite not being positively identified as John Bender Sr., this man's skull was displayed as that of Pa Bender in a salmon saloon until Prohibition forced its closure in 1920, and then the skull disappeared. So whether John Flickinger was John Bender or this man who was arrested in Salmon, Idaho was John Bender remains unknown. And finally, bullshit report number 4. After the Benders escaped Labette County, several groups of vigilantes formed to search for them. One of these groups claimed that they found the Benders and they shot all of them except for Kate, who they burned alive because she was a witch who had psychic powers or some shit. Another group claimed that they had caught the Benders and lynched them, and then they threw the bodies into the Verdigris River in Kansas. Another group claimed to have killed the Benders in a gunfight and then buried their bodies on the prairie. What prairie? Why don't they dig up the bodies and confirm it's them? No idea. Even though all of these different groups claim to have found the Benders, nobody ever got the $3,000 reward, and whatever really happened to the bloody Benders still remains unsolved.